Good afternoon, Anthony. This is part 2 with regards to our discussion on the origins of the domestic dog. And today we're going to be delving into the coloration of our hypothesized extinct jackal.
Yes, well, Canis rubro negrus, as I call it, a rather cheeky self-proclaimed taxonomic label for this hypothetical ancestor, main ancestor, not sole ancestor, but main ancestor of the domestic dog, namely a species that was present in the Pleistocene, probably in the northern parts of Eurasia at the end of the Ice Age, and then went extinct at some point before the modern period, with no trace in memory or in the bone record that was recognizable, but strangely enough reflected in the phenotypic appearance in many different breeds of the domestic dog today, and most classically in the form of the Kelpie, where this wonderful ancestral atavistic original black and tan coloration is accompanied by a body form in the Kelpie that is pretty much identical to the body form of the hypothetical ancestor. And so, strangely enough, without any fanfare, without even people realizing it, we've inadvertently retained the full appearance of this Pleistocene ancestral dog that was hypothetically the main ancestor of the domestic dog, down to its beautiful wild type coloration, which is, I wouldn't say it's the most beautiful, most aesthetically appealing coloration of any wild type in the genus Canis, because the Ethiopian species called the kekebero is also a beautiful animal. But certainly the modern Kelpie is one of the most ornate and artistically colored of all of the canids, and deserves to be recognized as such, as opposed to the current consensus view, which is that the domestic dog came mainly from the wolf, and that the Kelpie's coloration is nothing but a kind of a capricious and accidental domestic coloration.
Right, and your reasons for saying that it's a wild type, just to be clear, to get my head around this, is it's the symmetry of the coloration and the fact that the coloration keeps popping up in many different breeds of dog. Is that right? Is that what it boils down to?
Those are two of the more important reasons. There is at least one other reason, and that is that the actual pattern that we see in the modern Kelpie and in the other black and tan phenotypes in various breeds of the domestic dog follows the same kind of rationale as we see in many wild animals, particularly ungulates like antelopes. So you can explain why some parts are dark and some parts are pale, and so it's not just symmetrical, it's not just persistent, despite all of the other modifications of body form in the domestic breeding process, but it's also thoroughly understandable as a wild type coloration in terms of concepts such as flags, coloration flags that accentuate certain body parts for certain social and other reasons.
And the fact that it's dark above and pale below also fits with what one sees in the wild for many ungulates, and the concept there is that's adaptive from a predation point of view. It's a more camouflaged coloration than if it were pale on the top and dark underneath. Are we saying there was a predator of that ancestral jackal, and it was better to be colored in this way from a camouflage perspective?
Well, actually, I understand the logic that you're presenting, which is the logic of counter shading.
Yeah.
So there's a logic whereby an animal is a kind of a nondescript tone, but then has paler underparts in order to compensate for the shading effect. In other words, making it as flat as possible against the background, so it doesn't stand out by virtue of its own shadows. But that actually, ironically, is not the argument I'm invoking in the case of the ancestral jackal-like species Canis rubronegris. In fact, this particular jackal is colored for conspicuousness rather than for hiding. And we can get an idea of that adaptive agenda from the kekebero. Now, let me introduce the kekebero because that animal is still alive, and you can see beautiful photographs of it on the web.
Yeah.
That's Kekebero, and you probably won't find it by Googling it because it's a name that I invented to replace the rather inept names of Ethiopian wolf and simian fox.
Okay.
But it's Canis simensis. It's rare and endangered. It's found only in a few little parts of highland Ethiopia, where it may or may not survive in the longer term. And this is a good example of a species of Canis, which morphologically is very much just like a jackal, but it has a conspicuous type coloration for some social reason. It's semi-gregarious. It lives in open habitats. And it's an example of an animal that is somewhat gazelle-like in the sense that it's colored for conspicuousness rather than for blending in. And that may be because the kekebero, unlike other species of Canis, eats mainly rodents. And so it doesn't really need to hide from them because, the rodents can be caught in a way where whether the predator is hidden or not doesn't really make any difference. What the kekebero does is it watches for mole rats to be active near the surface. And then it creeps up on them. They can't see it anyway because they're just beneath ground surface. It creeps up on them and capitalizes on their proximity to the surface by making a little jumping arc and pouncing on them and grabbing them before they duck back underground. So the kekebero has been able to dispense with the normal cryptic counter-shaded coloration of other canids such as the coyote. And instead, it's got 3 conspicuous features on its body that you can see even at a distance. Number one is it's got a pale and dark pattern at the base of the tail, conspicuously so. Too conspicuous to be explained by some kind of camouflage effect. Secondly, it's got a pale pattern on the chest that, again, is striking enough that when the animal sits down and faces its chest towards you, particularly in the evening light, it acts like a flag. Right.
Yeah, I can see.
And then
that.
thirdly, and most intriguingly, on the inside of the foreleg, particularly the foreleg, not the hind leg, but on the inside of the foreleg, you'll see that as the animal walks, there's a conspicuous pale panel that cannot be explained except as a flag. That is what I call a pedal flag, the word pedal referring to the foot. And so whether it's sitting facing you, or facing away from you, or walking in front of you, the kekebero, otherwise known as the Ethiopian wolf or simian fox, announces itself, presumably for social reasons, by using the appropriately conspicuous body parts and accentuating them with a dark pale contrast. And what Canis rubronegris, the hypothetical main ancestor of the domestic dog, has is an allied but differently emphasized pattern, which we can explain the adaptive significance of.
Excellent. So thanks. So this advertising it's intra-specific, just communication amongst the animals as opposed to advertising to a predator. Is that your take on it?
Yes. I'm not invoking any mechanism of advertising to predators.
Okay.
But the logic is still more or less the same as in gazelles. And let me just digress just for a moment. If you go to an allied genus of the canidae called Lupulella, Lupulella, that genus has 2 African jackals in it. The black-backed jackal and the side-striped jackal. They're now in their own genus Lupulella, which is where they belong because they're actually not Canis-like.
Yeah.
And the black-backed jackal is another example of a small dog-like canid that has a basically conspicuous coloration because it has a kind of a gazelle-like side stripe that's bold enough that it does not contribute to hiding the animal. It contributes to announcing the animal. And so
Mm.
we've got two precedents for similar sized members of the dog family. They're all about 10 kilograms, whether it's Canis rubronegris or the black-backed jackal or the kekebero. They've all about, typical jackal size, about 10 kilos. They all live in fairly open environments, and they have some interesting balance between evading predation and facilitating their own social relationships by having a relatively conspicuous pattern, in which the conspicuousness is not just a meaningless piebald pattern, but is a subtle and nuanced and cunningly contrived coloration that judiciously emphasizes certain body parts in certain situations in order to achieve communication among members of the species without being blatantly conspicuous in the way that, for example, the bontebok is, with its grossly pied coloration that is, instantly recognizable even a kilometer away. So the important thing about these particular small canids is that they are interestingly conspicuous in certain ways, and the same is true for the black and tan kelpie once you get your eye in for that functional pattern of adaptive coloration.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you just scan the web for images of the black-backed jackal and the Ethiopian wolf and compare those images with the kelpie, there are remarkable similarities in terms of the flags and the black back. The flags that you described, the pale patches on the chest and the legs, for example, of the wolf and the kelpie.
Well, that's right. And at risk of bewildering listeners who are not familiar with coloration, let me dwell for a moment on how subtle and wonderful the adaptive process has been, particularly on the chest area. Okay, so if you go to, for example, the wolf and the coyote, and the Eurasian jackal Canis aureus, all of those three species have a subtle transverse or horizontal banding between the face and the upper legs, in which there are three different pale horizontal streaks. You can see it in some photos of the wolf, some photos of the coyote, and many photos of the Eurasian jackal. And this particular pale banding pattern in those animals helps to camouflage the canid as it approaches its prey. Okay, so this pattern on the front is obviously a deeply ancestral pattern in the genus Canis, and in most existing species it functions for camouflage, a subtle form of camouflage, but camouflage nonetheless.
Yeah.
And that's in keeping with the fact that the wolf, the coyote, and the Eurasian jackal are basically in this inconspicuously colored, rather nondescript fawn animals that have the capacity, particularly when they're hunting alone, to stalk prey, much like a cat does. Okay. Yeah. Now, what's happened in the kekebero, and in a slightly different way in Canis rubronegris, the putative main ancestor of the domestic dog, is that transverse pale series of bands has been modified in such a way as to make it more conspicuous. It's just a shift in emphasis, but it flips over into a new category of function, if you see what I'm saying. So the pattern is the same, but by an artful, natural shift in emphasis, it goes from essentially camouflage-based to essentially flag-like. It goes from essentially contributing to the concealment of the stalking animal through to contributing to the announcement, the flagging of the socially advertising animal. And in the kelpie, the way you can see it is that in the kelpie, that three band pale pattern has been reduced to a single prominently pale patch right on the chest itself. And the dark pale contrast, as you can see in that photograph that you've pulled up now, is the dark pale contrast is now obvious. It helps to make the animal stand out from its environment rather than blend in. Do you see that?
Yeah.
And then turning to the hind parts, it's an odd thing for any carnivorous mammal to have what I call an ischial flag, which is a pale, conspicuous patch on the bum, on the buttocks. But the Kelpie has this. You can't see it in many photographs because people with domestic dogs are not particularly fond of taking pictures of their dogs' bums. So it's actually hard to find even a single photograph on the web of the buttocks of a domestic dog. But if you watch Kelpies in your neighborhood, you'll very quickly see that every Kelpie with a black and tan pattern does have some kind of pale, conspicuous patch on its buttocks. And furthermore, it's wild type in the sense that every individual has a slightly different configuration, slightly different tone, slightly different shape. Sometimes there's a hair whirl. Sometimes there's a little flurry of white to the side of it. It's very individualized, but it's always completely symmetrical, and it's always completely consistent with the kind of individual variation you get in, for example, antelopes that also have pronounced hindquarters advertisements. And that simply announces the animal as it moves away. It's like a departure signal, which is a pattern very common in nature, including doves and pigeons, and all sorts of animals have got flight announcements in the sense of coloration patterns of a dark and pale nature that kind of emphasize the fact that they're leaving. Now, coming back to the wolf has nothing of the sort. The wolf does have palish buttocks, but they're never accentuated by adjacent dark, and they're never conspicuous. There's no individual in the whole of the wolf species, including even the ones that have been kind of intergressed with the domestic dog and are generally dark, as in Yellowstone. None of them ever have a pale patch on the buttocks that we could call an ischial flag. And furthermore, the wolf does not raise its tail in the way that the domestic dog does. So even if the wolf had a pale patch on its buttocks, it wouldn't tend to be shown off well because the wolf tends to keep its tail down. And the same is true for the coyote, and the same is true for the Eurasian jackal. But in the domestic dog, and this seems to indicate a different ancestry, many breeds of the domestic dog tend to hold their tail up high. This is particularly bred to a kind of an extreme in the Spitz breeds that hold their tails, compulsively and extremely erect. But most breeds of dogs, when they're walking around sniffing things, they'll tend to hold their tail above the horizontal, thus exposing their buttocks. And so when a domestic dog does have an ischial flag, it operates much like the ischial flag of a gazelle or many other kinds of antelopes like antelopes and deer like mule deer and so on. So you see how all of these things fit in beautifully into a concept of wild type symmetrical coloration.
No, absolutely. And for the patterning on the chest to flip from camouflage to advertisements, I guess that indicates that the prey of the ancestral dog was different to the prey of say the blackback jackal or the wolf. Do you think it would have been something like a mole rat, like the Ethiopian wolf? The mole rat, it doesn't matter what the coloration on the chest is for an Ethiopian wolf, so it's able to turn it into an advertisement, but it does matter for the true wolf and the blackback jackal. So does the pattern give a sense of what the prey species was likely to be?
Well, you're right at the forefront of thinking here. I mean, I've been thinking about this now for decades, and I've never actually got to that level of questioning it. But now that you ask the question, I think it is plausible, because in the Ice Age in Europe, there would have been a few areas that were, shall we say, tundra-like. And in tundra-like environments, there are many suitable rodents for prey in the vole and lemming groups. And these animals can be hunted in much the same way as the kekebero on the Ethiopian highlands hunts its prey, because in the summertime, these vole-like and lemming-like animals live just under the grass layer. And in wintertime, they tend to remain active by having tunnels, horizontal tunnels under the snow.
Yeah.
And so it's quite easy to imagine that the real ancestor of the domestic dog was a mainly rodent-eating carnivore, also a scavenger, a general omnivorous enough to capitalize on, for example, subarctic and northern European fruits in the autumn, in much the same way that the coyote does in other biomes. Many species of canis and canids generally eat quite a lot of fruit, and this even applies to the wild fox, vulpes vulpes. So between the offal, old bones lying around, human feces, seasonal fruits, and these abundant and fecund various rodents allied to moles and lemmings, it's easy to imagine that this particular kind of jackal did not actually need to be camouflaged enough to hunt down the kind of prey that other canids rely on.
Right, and its conspicuousness with that dark black back. What predators in that environment might have been problematic for the wolf? I guess would have been after that jackal, hyenas as well over time.
Well, I suspect that Canis rubro-negrus of the late Pleistocene in Eurasia had many different formidable predators in much the same way that the existing black-backed jackal in Africa, Lupulela mesomelas, has. I mean, the black-backed jackal is an intensely capable animal in a predatory situation. Firstly, its natural habitat is brimming with large carnivores of impressive size and impressive diversity, and all of them cheerfully kill it at the slightest opportunity. Secondly, when you remove all of these large predators, as you find on farms in the interior of South Africa, and the main predator becomes sheep farmers who loathe the black-backed jackal and try to kill it at every opportunity, it still survives. So it is kind of puzzling that a jackal-like animal manages to live in a fairly conspicuous form against the gun of all this predation, but that's exactly what the black-backed jackal does and continues to do right in front of us, even in land like in the Karoo of South Africa, where all of the big predators have been eliminated, and human beings with all their technical prowess and all their intellectual determination still cannot wipe it out. So these animals are capable of surviving predation even where they don't try to hide particularly from the predators.
Yeah. And the proportions, the size of the animal and its general physique there's not much to ponder there. It's likely to be similar to the Ethiopian wolf or the black-backed jackal, and that's what the kelpie is, isn't it? It's so the coloration, the kelpie shows the wild type coloration, but it probably shows the wild type physique of the animal in the appropriate proportions as well. Would you agree?
I do agree, and I think that one of the great best kept secrets that's hiding in plain sight in the mammalogical world is right under our noses, and that is that a dog that we take to be completely familiar, completely domestic, and very much anthropogenic, namely the black and tan kelpie, is the spitting image of its 30,000-year-old extinct ancestor.
That's quite
which is a biological feat that it's difficult that we could have accomplished even if we had set out to do it. There are many rebreeding programs in the world that are more like pipe dreams, like bringing back mammoths, or even bringing back the extinct quagga in South Africa, that fabulously half-striped counterpart of the plain zebra that used to roam the Karoo and the Highveld, but went unfortunately extinct in the 1800s. People are almost desperate to rebreed these animals in remorse for having driven them to extinction, and yet with consummate ease, in fact, without even intending to do so, and most ironically, without even realizing that we've done it, we have somehow managed to reconstitute in almost perfect form both the I wouldn't say the genotype, but the almost complete phenotype of an animal that went extinct millennia ago.
Yeah.
And moreover, that beautiful wild type creature with its gazelle-like symmetrical beauty treats us as one of its own, as if it considers itself human. It's the most fabulous and almost incredible story of biology.
Yeah, absolutely wonderful. Is it unique if we look through our other domesticated friends, horses, cattle, stroke bosts, sheep, goats? Is there anything like this where we can say, hang on, we're living with a wild animal in coloration and physical form? That's the one question I have. Another question is, what about the mentality stroke social behavior of the animal? You hinted at it, that despite all its wild type features, the kelpie is probably very different to the ancestral animal in terms of its psyche, or is the kelpie perhaps one of the more boisterous, difficult to manage dogs because the ancestral psyche has come along with the coloration? So yeah, two separate questions there.
Yeah, well, it's a wonderful set of questions, and it's hard to answer this concisely because there's so many different strands involved. So I'll just jump in anywhere. Firstly, the kelpie is unusually intelligent.
Okay.
And in that sense, you could make the case that the original intelligence of the ancestral animal, Canis rubra still persists. But I wouldn't say that that's mechanistically accurate, because probably along the way it lost much of its intelligence in the process of domestication, and then had the intelligence reconstituted by selective breeding for the particular purpose of assisting in sheep pastoralism. Now, this raises an interesting point that, again, I'll just jump sideways. There'll be no kind of flow in what I'm saying, but it may all eventually make sense. Now, another example of a wild type coloration in a pretty much thoroughly domesticated mammal is the Maasai donkey.
Okay.
Now, some donkeys have typical domestic type coloration, all black or piebald or whatever. But there's a particular, I wouldn't even call it a breed, because the Maasai don't breed it at all. But the donkeys that the Maasai use in a very casual, offhand manner for carrying their water and other burdens, and then basically for the rest of the time leave to fend for themselves. That donkey looks the spitting image of its ancestor. It's got a really lovely wild type coloration, and almost every individual in Maasai land is the same coloration, with the usual individual slight variations, much as in black and tan dogs. The difference is that there's no reason to think that those Maasai donkeys went through a period in which they looked anything like a true domestic breed. So in other words, when you look at the wild type coloration of a Maasai donkey, you're looking at a direct line back from the original donkey. Okay, right. But in the case of the kelpie, it's not the case, because astonishingly enough, if you look at the breed history of the kelpie, it was bred from something like a border collie. And a border collie, as you know, is completely different. First of all, it's got the piebald black and white pattern, the asymmetrical, anthropogenic, mutant type pattern. And it also has long hair. And so somehow they took the collie, which was intensely altered by domestication, both in terms of its coloration and its pelage, texture and length, and also its intelligence, which is a particular kind of intelligence that's compatible with assisting sheep farmers in herding domestic livestock. And then through some inadvertent genetic quirk, they managed to reconstitute the spitting image of Canis rubra, but with the anthropogenically selected intelligence. So you've reconstituted the ancestral intelligence, but in a different form, a form that's extremely compatible with human requirements. It's just as intelligent as its wild ancestor, but not in in a way that would be appropriate for the wild ancestor. Instead, it's appropriate on a sheep farm. And what's marvelous about all of this is that the almost impossible feat has been achieved of reaching into a border collie, which looks so domesticated that it shows no kind of affinity with its wild ancestors. And you've somehow pulled out of that, a bit like the quagga rebreeding project in South Africa aims to pull the quagga out of the genes of the Birchall zebra. You've pulled out the ancestral phenotype in almost complete form. It's mind-boggling, and all the more mind-boggling for the fact that nobody realizes that this has been done. It's a subject that's absolutely never discussed. This podcast is the first time it's ever been discussed by voice or in literature in the world. It's just a completely blank subject.
Yeah.
But anyway, coming back to some other aspects of this, we have to assume that the ancestral Canis rubronegros, like most other members of the genus Canis, had an essentially monogamous sociosexual pattern. And what that meant is that the male and the female married for life. I don't know if listeners understand this, but this is the basic pattern in the genus Canis. You have monogamous marriage, and if both partners survive, that goes on for life. Life is not very long in these animals; it's about a decade. And so they stay married. And what's very unusual about the genus Canis in the sweep of mammals is that you actually have paternal care. And what I mean by paternal care is that the male doesn't just defend the offspring; he actually feeds them, which is a very strange thing for a mammal to do. We humans take it for granted, but even we humans don't do it that well, because the role of the man in human marriage and human reproduction is more as protector and provider, but provider in the sense of giving it to the mother to give to the kids, giving the food to the mother, right? But what the genus Canis does is the male actually carries the food back in his own stomach and then regurgitates it directly to his own infants. And so it's hard to think of a mammal in the whole panoply of mammals in the world that is more paternally devoted and parentally active than the father in the genus Canis. And as far as we know, all members of the genus Canis are like this. We've got the wolf, the coyote, the Eurasian jackal, the North African jackal, and the kekebero, and now Canis rubronegros from the Pleistocene. And the point I'm trying to make is that was probably bred out of Canis rubronegros when it became domesticated, because we know that in general, the domestic dog has lost its monogamy, because it's been more convenient in the interest of domestication for it to transfer its allegiance to us. And so dogs are different from most wild species of their genus because they've become promiscuous. As far as I know, no domestic dog breed has a monogamous tendency within its own species.
Right.
And so we've taken the original monogamy together with that wonderful paternal care, and we've made it into a more promiscuous kind of animal that is easier to manipulate according to our breeding program in selective breeding. And so I don't expect that the Kelpie is any different from that. It's lost the original wild monogamy. So when you look beneath the hood, you see that the phenotype, the phenotypic resemblance with the ancestral jackal hides a bunch of functional features that can only be explained by domestication. So that goes for intelligence, it goes for the breeding pattern, and it probably goes also for the herding habit, because I doubt whether the original black and tan jackal of Eurasia in the Pleistocene was so fixated upon herding ungulates, So the wonder of the black and tan Kelpie is that it looks exactly like its 30,000-year-old ancestor, but it's been wonderfully tailored and trimmed and programmed and edited and groomed into this perfect collaborator for human interests, particularly on a working farm. Not so much as a lounge pet, because it's much too active and intelligent to put up with just being a lounge pet. But if you have it working on a farm, it's a magnificent creature. And everybody who's worked with Kelpies knows how magnificent they are in a working environment. But I think not one of them will know that it's also magnificent in being the spitting image of not only an extinct wild ancestor, but possibly the most beautiful of all of the genus Canis.
Yeah, yeah. No, it is a absolutely beautiful animal. I'm trying to imagine it in its home range, hunting the voles. I wonder if there's still an instinctive urge there. If we took some kelpies out onto the tundra and watched them in action, just roaming around in the summer, tundra summer. My two small dogs here in the garden, they love pouncing in a similar manner to the Ethiopian wolf on golden mole runnels here in my cuckoo lawn. They exhibit a similar hunting strategy to that Ethiopian wolf with the golden moles. They haven't, to my knowledge, they haven't managed to catch one, but it's a similar motion, and perhaps that's just deep in the Canis programming as opposed to the hypothetical ancestor. But it's just fun watching dogs in action, taking this into account.
I think what you say is exactly right. Now, it's not just the fact that all of the members of the genus Canis have this pouncing behavior on rodents. It also occurs in South American canids, like the canids you find on the Pampas, and also in the fox genus Vulpes. You can find plenty of coverage of videos and photographs of Vulpes, the red fox, doing exactly the same thing. So this is a deeply canid pattern.
Right.
Walking quietly up to where a rodent is busy, just under the surface, and then pouncing in a beautiful little athletic arc.
Yes,
such that
exactly.
you come down on it before your footfalls get too close. If the animal if the predator were to walk closer up to the prey, that would make slight vibrations in the earth. So what it does is it jumps, comes down from above.
Yeah.
And that's obviously deeply programmed. Now, it's a fascinating thought experiment that if you took, say, a population of 20 kelpies and subjected them to a feral existence by abandoning them somewhere where there's quite a few rodents, and then watched them, would they quickly revert to that ancestral pattern of pouncing on rodents? I simply don't know, but I suspect they would. I think that has not bred out of them. I think it's just that it's hidden from generation to generation in such a way that generations of dog owners never see that behavior simply because there's no need for it to occur.
Yeah.
So you could probably reconstitute even that circumstantially, reconstitute even the original hunting locomotion or pouncing method or stalking method of the animal by putting it in an environment where that becomes necessary again.
Yeah, yeah. And does the wolf do that out of interest, or are the rodents too small for the wolf to bother with?
I've never seen a photograph of a wolf doing it, but I do assume it happens, yes, because the wolf, although preferring large prey, is perfectly capable of hunting ground squirrels and other smaller rodents. I'd be amazed if the wolf doesn't use the same technique from time to time.
Yeah, just catching voles as a side snack, as it were.
Yes, no, it's a perfectly respectable way for a wolf to tide itself over between larger meals. Is pouncing on vole-sized rodents. Yes.
Yeah. Good. Well, thanks, Anthony. That's a new framing for listeners, I would think, in terms of watching the domestic dog as we walk through our parks, and look forward to developing the concept further with you.
Yes, well, thank you. I've enjoyed it because, a theme has emerged over my life that I've become more and more conscious of, which is that some of the most wonderful, one of the deepest and most beautiful mysteries are the ones that are closest to home. And by that, I mean that our own nature, our own biological nature as a human species is often the most mysterious thing. So this idea that you need to go to the far depths of the ocean or into the jungles of the Congo to find biologically worthwhile topics is quite wrong, because we humans are the ultimate mystery in many ways. We know ourselves so poorly biologically, and that applies also to the animals closest to us. And so you need go no further than your own kelpie in order to get into the deepest and most wonderful biological mystery when you actually frame it in a novel way. And to me, that's such an exhilarating and encouraging thought as a biologist in a world where wildlife is getting scarcer and scarcer. We're not running out of beautiful, aesthetically and intellectually wonderful mysteries to probe.
Absolutely. And on that stimulating thought, we'll draw it to a close and look forward to our podcast ahead. Thanks very much, Anthony.
Thank you. And to listeners, please like, subscribe, and share. And we look forward to joining you next time for another segment here at Exploring the Bio Edge. And from us, over and out for now.
Ciao.